So rather than just criticising, we need to think about what are the alternatives. And my alternatives are focused in on not what we do with our vast areas of forest landscape, but what we do around our settlements. Because the evidence is that it's not, yes, there hasn't been enough fuel reduction burning over vast areas of forest that was the cause of threat to settlement. It's what happens right at that interface close to where houses are, which is the significant part. And I would argue that it's actually even greater significance is what happens in and around the house. And finally, was there an able-bodied person present? So we need to get that priorities, that the priority is right with us and our immediate, often private patch, and then there's the next bit of land, which we could call these community forests, the bits of forest that's close to human settlement. And of course, often it's very, very close. So the first thing we can look at is accelerated decomposition of fuels. Rather than just, oh, we get rid of fuel by burning it, the other way fuel disappears is it turns into compost. Is it possible to accelerate that? And then to retain fire retardant and low fire hazard trees. There are huge differences in how trees burn. There's differences between our sclerophyll low fertility vegetation and our rainforest species. And certainly there's huge differences between our sclerophyll native vegetation and deciduous trees and garden and food trees, many of which are naturally fire retardant. And thirdly, we need to look at ecological thinning of forest to reduce the density, this unnatural density that we have in modern forests, where we have large numbers of suppressed small trees that act as fuel to carry fires from the ground up into the crown. So I've got three examples of that there that I want to look at in turn. Firstly, the accelerated decomposition. We can reduce brambles, especially blackberries, litter, and the treetops from thinning using people, animals and machines. We can use fire rakes, slash hooks and chainsaws to get stuff down on the ground, keep it down when the ground is wet and accelerate that decomposition, get the air out of it. We can combine it with moisture and water flows, directing storm water off streets into swales where litter and compost is accumulated. We can add nutrients, both nitrogen, phosphate, calcium, a bit of animal manure, a bit of lime, because a lot of the material we're trying to decompose is extremely carbon rich. We know from a composting point of view that it's difficult for that material to break down. And we can add fungi, microbes and worms. We can just go out into the forest where there is good forest compost and litter and seed a bit of that into this material. So this is working in the gully below our place, cutting down blackberry, packing it down into the bottom of the gully so it decomposes. Of course, the blackberry itself is a fire retardant plant, but the huge bundles of annual dry canes that build up underneath are extremely flammable. Just merely getting that material down onto the ground makes a big difference. And people can do this, obviously at the appropriate scale. We can take the heads of trees that have been cut and put them on the contour and reduce them dramatically with a chainsaw as an alternative to having to have a large-scale chipper, which is a more intensive landscape sort of technique that obviously we're familiar with. You can see that drop in the level there of that pile of blue gum foliage as I'm cutting through it with the chainsaw, and it drops from a height like this down to this, and then another stack on top same thing, done in dry, moist conditions, you then get the decomposition. It's amazing how we forget that the main way we've controlled fuel in this country, in our vast grazing landscapes, is that animals eat that fuel, which is the reason we don't have raging grass fires across our agricultural landscapes every year. And yet we've got rid of grazing animals from where people live. And of course these grass fuels are annual fuels. A lot of the other fuels build up very slowly over a period of years. Sheep, of course, have been the default animal for controlling those grass fuels. Goats are much more effective at eating a lot of the other material which tends to colonise our high rainfall areas, those blackberries, gorse, broom and other species that often sheep don't eat. And this converting it into something useful occurs also because they break down fuel by trampling it and by the addition of manure. And we get that as something as a result. Of course, the reason we don't do this is we've become so affluent that we live out of the oil well. You know, milk comes from the shop, so we don't need to bother with such things. It's how my community stayed without being burnt out most of the 20th century, because people had that frugal, self-reliant, small peasant farming culture which actually controlled the fuel levels. Of course, we do have other tools at our disposal now, and there is some amazing equipment around, and some of it is being used because it fits into the paradigm of, well, we're affluent people and we don't use a slash hook and we don't have goats. But there are these cool things that use fossil fuel in a way that converts some of that heavy material back onto the ground as mulch, and therefore accelerates that decomposition. And well, it's better than a lot of other things we do with fossil fuel. And we're a rich country, so yes, we should use some of these things, such as they call gorse groomers down our way, and these power mulchers and slashers, and obviously chippers. The next theme is this one of retaining and extending fire retardant trees. And I suppose in the Blue Mountains, this might be a very heretical idea, like it is in a lot of places, because a lot of the species that are these fire retardant trees that are most useful in the landscape and most common in the landscape don't happen to be native species. So firstly, deciduous trees tend to shade out gorse, blackberry and grass fuels by their very dense summer canopy, even though they don't have a canopy in the winter. And they accelerate the decomposition of litter, especially because they're dropping their leaves in the autumn, not in the summer. And they're low fire hazard or retardant in bushfires. This is an example of a retained willow corridor at the lavender farm at Shepherd's Flat in our area, where the owner resisted the temptations from the catchment authority to remove all the willows. Nature's actually an equal opportunity employer that does not distinguish on the basis of species. And these new mixed ecologies are actually showing a lot of environmental service values. In our gullies, we've got naturalised sycamore trees, which are extremely fire retardant, and new plantings of deciduous trees amongst these blackberry-dominated landscapes that were sluiced out by the gold miners 100 years ago were maintained in a relatively fire-safe state by grazing animals in the earlier part of the 20th century, but of course there was no rebuilding of the soil under those conditions, whereas there's a huge rebuilding of soil that's happening in these environments under these so-called weedscapes. We need to protect our most fire-safe forests from willful and wasteful destruction. Now, this may not so dramatic in the Blue Mountains, but in our area where we have these corridor willow forests amongst open farm landscapes, this sort of destruction by catchment authorities using taxpayers' funds is negligence on a gross scale. These are the most fire retardant environments we have, and of course once you remove this willow canopy, the blackberries come back with a resurgence, and then even if the revegetation program is successful, we end up with a dense stand of eucalypts and acacias with no plan to actually manage or thin that stand, and 20 or 30 years later you have a classic fire corridor along our streams. And of course this is happening in our rural farmed landscapes, radically changed landscapes, and our peri-urban landscapes close to human settlement.